you. I hope that in our conversations today, we can be grounded in an awareness of our individual places and our responsibility to uphold treaties, or be present and aware as guests and neighbors where land disputes, which is the contemporary term for treaty negotiations, are underway. This is especially important here, given the unfolding events and ongoing settler violence at Saulnier Wharf in Sipekne'katik First Nation. How are we showing up as treaty people to stop this violence and to demand that the Canadian government upholds its treaty obligations to honor Mi'kmaq right to harvest and moderate livelihood? Courtney, is it possible to drop resources and with like more information on ways to support Mi'kmaq resistance in the chat? Cool. That is going to happen momentarily.
And we would also like to acknowledge the history of African Nova Scotians on this land and what it means for Center for Art Tapes, where I am currently doing this event, to be situated in Halifax's central north end, an area that has historically been the home for African Nova Scotian families. Throughout this presentation, in all of CFAT's programming, we wish to acknowledge the history of this land and the ways in which our organization can best serve and collaborate with the many arts communities in Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. So I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of 3 virtual discussions, part of the speaker series, We Regret to Inform You, hosted by CFAT and facilitated by Dr. Julie Hollenbach. We were approached by Julie to collaborate on this event series, and we're so grateful that we get to do it. We Regret to Inform You is a series of talks that considers our ideas around success and failure in the arts. And the series aims to decenter narratives of success in Western art worlds and cultural practice, oftentimes at talks and artists will center experiences of success and highlighting successful projects and all the things in their practice that have worked. What is oftentimes so precious and so rarely talked about is what happens when things don't go as planned. Setbacks and failures are normal, everyday occurrences that are fundamental and sometimes generative, part of a creative practice. So the hope here is to create community conversations and destigmatize failure, which can look like setbacks, dead ends, rejection from grants or exhibition proposals, taking a break, blockage, impasse, and it goes on and on. And We Regret to Inform You will critically consider success and stories and the myth that everyone can achieve success in a colonialist, white supremacist, neoliberal, capitalist society. In this discussion, we hope to critically assess the cultural systems that fail so many folks while giving complexity to the myriad experiences that exist in the arts.
So welcome. It's wonderful that we can all be here and join together. Just a heads up that today's discussion may touch on histories and contemporary experiences of systemic oppression, including racism, misogyny, homophobia, and ableism. Not to mention that there's already so much in the air given what's happening politically with our friends, family, neighbors down south, and the ways that those events will undoubtedly affect and have ripples that will be felt around the world. So keeping that in mind, please take care of yourselves. If you feel distressed or uncomfortable at any point during today's discussion, please take a break. Taking a break can look like turning off your screen and muting your speakers, stepping away from your computer, going to your window, drinking a glass of water, grabbing a snack, hugging your dog, stretching. If it feels comfortable and possible to come back, please join us. If not, please leave. Take good care of yourselves. Prioritize your well-being. So now, before we get started, before I introduce Merray, a few Zoom housekeeping notes for our evening together. Please note that this talk is being recorded. Anything that you can see on the screen or anything that is said or spoken into a mic will be captured by the video recording. However, things that are happening in the chat will not make it into the recording, just to give you a sense. A reminder to please keep your mic off during the talk, or unless you're speaking during the conversation or discussion part of the evening. Also, a note that if you have things that you'd like to say to Merray and I, or ways that you would like to join the conversation during the open discussion period at the end, please capture that in the chat so that you don't forget, so that we know that it's there. And then that can be a nice document or repository for conversation prompts later on.
And if you feel comfortable doing so, please feel free to include your pronouns next to your name. You can do that by clicking the little blue square at the top right of your video screen. And we ask that you care for yourself and care for others while we're in this space together. We will reserve the right to ask anyone to leave the space for discrimination, violent acts, or any behavior that makes others feel unsafe or uncomfortable. There will be multiple moderators tonight. I will be one of them, and my coworker, Tom Elliott, who also is at Center for Art Tapes, will also be a moderator. You can see him with the red CFAT logo and the name Center for Art Tapes. Please feel free to directly message us if anything's not feeling okay for you, or if you want to get our attention for any reason.
Thanks, Courtney. So now, without further ado, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce our guest and featured speaker this evening, Merray Gerges. So Merray writes around art rather than about it. She studied art history at NASCAD and journalism at King's University in Halifax, where she co-founded and co-edited Crit, a free biannual criticism publication. She was editorial resident at Canadian Art in 2016 and assistant editor there from 2017 to 2019. From 2019 to 2020, she was the inaugural editorial fellow at C Magazine, where she produced 3 themed issues addressing systemic change post Canada 150. Her writing has tended to pay attention more to art's contexts rather than its contents. Please join me in welcoming Merray. So you can do this by like turning on your camera and waving, or throwing up your favorite reactionary emoji. Yeah, welcome, Merray. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks everybody for being here on this evening. Excited to be in dialogue with you, Julie, and to unpack some stuff with you.
Definitely. So maybe as a way to sort of start, I'll like intro some of the themes that we were thinking about talking about and touching on. We were thinking about engaging in conversations that move around the conundrum of keeping well and flourishing within a neoliberal, capitalist, economic and social system. A system that pushes people to labor and produce at inhumane levels. And then when people experience stress, distress, burnout, and breakdown, breakdown. The real insidious piece of the system is that it frames this individual shortcoming, this individual failure, as the problem of the person, of the individual, rather than a systemic failure. A systemic failure that fails individuals and communities alike. So Merray, perhaps to get us started, could you talk a little bit about your writing practice? Situate us in where you are now in your work.
Sure. So I'll tell you a little bit about a project that I started in my undergrad at King's Journalism that gave me some of the, that helped me find some of the driving forces that I think still exist in my work today. So I was doing research in NASCAD's back catalog and found back issues of Visual Arts Nova Scotia, where a curator by the name of Pamela Edmonds, who is the chief curator at the McMaster Museum of Art now, had written a review about a show called In This Place, which took place at NASCAD in 1998. And it was curated by David Woods, who's an African Nova Scotian poet and curator. And it was said to be the first ever exhibition of Black Nova Scotian art in at NASCAD ever. And at that time, I had been in my art history program for about 2 or 3 years, and I wondered why I had never heard anything about an exhibition that sounded like it was quite historic. And so I started to track down some of the people involved to ask questions about what this exhibition was, what drove it, what it was like, and at the same time, I was also asking questions about how I had seen initiatives especially by banks like TD that supported African Heritage Month. Is it still called that in Nova Scotia? Well, Black History Month, AKA. And I wondered about the complications and the contradictions of that support. And so those two currents got me to question how art history is written and who gets to write it, what we can say about erasures of particular outputs and particular histories in it. And I was also curious about the chasm, the gap between what an institution claims and what it actually practices. So what does it mean for TD Bank to sponsor African Heritage Month exhibitions? And where was that support when it wasn't February? And that question around the chasm between proclamation and practice is one that still very much drives what I do and how I do it. And it's very much grounded in a kind of journalistic methodology that I think pays more attention to what isn't said, what isn't included, than to what is.
How did that project unfold?
I found Pamela Edmonds on Facebook, and I sent her a Facebook message, and I was like, hey, came across this review that you wrote in 1998, but so I forgot to mention that she was also involved in a gallery called the Multicultural Arts Resource Center, which was a gallery in Halifax that seemed to only exist for like a hot second. And it was a space that endeavored to provide support for artists who are newcomers in Canada. So it helped them, learn how to write CVs or, learn how to apply for grants. And I couldn't find anything about this space other than what Pamela had written. And so Pamela was involved with the Black Artists Network of Nova Scotia, and she's a curator who's done so much to advocate for Black Canadian artists for decades. Yeah, so like I said, I mentioned I was studying art history at NASCAD at the time, and I was like, why the fuck am I not learning about any of these histories? And so anyway, I tracked down Pam, and when I spoke with her and when I spoke with David Woods, they gave me a lot of insight into how I came to understand tokenism and how I came to understand token support. You know, that art institutions and that funding institutions seem to only want to support art by BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color, when it was convenient or easy or trendy to do so. And they talked about how difficult it was to be, you know, advocating for the artists that they were in the absence of that investment that was genuine, and investment that you know, transcended the bounds of, like, you know, flavor of the month or whatever. And those conversations were happening for me back in 2013, 2014. And so when I started to work in magazines in 2016, a lot of those questions and a lot of those conversations were still at the back of mind for me. And even though, you know, both Pam and David had been doing that work for decades, it seemed to me like a lot of their concerns and a lot of the things that they were struggling with were still very much felt by BIPOC of my generation. And I've been invested in trying to find a way out of that loop.
So I think, like, we'll definitely circle around, and I would love to talk to you more about tokenism and representation and some of those ideas. But I was wondering if you could, like, thank you for sharing this project that sort of grounded and started off your practice. I was really struck by your idea or your investigation of this project as a narrative that wasn't captured in local art histories, and was wondering if you could reflect on how that positioned your work, and how, if you have thoughts about how, like, history is very much a living document and how what is written now matters.
Yeah, I take that I take that responsibility quite seriously, as a critic and as a journalist. I think I mean, I think that imperative goes all the way back to undergrad, when I co-founded Crit with a couple of other people in my at school, who were similarly feeling frustrated with the lack of resources or spaces for emerging writers, thinkers to publish our work. And so in a way, I would say that attending to absence was something that was very present in my work from the beginning. And I think a lot about I've spent a lot of time thinking about how, you know, as a person of color who has the light skin privilege that I do, and who has the education privilege that I do, and the class privilege that I do, has a responsibility to my thoughts around this sharpened quite distinctly. I remember when I was doing a residency at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia back in 2015, and I remember having a conversation with an artist of color who was nominated for the Soviet Art Award. And when we met, it was my first time seeing another person of color inside that building who wasn't a security guard. And I remember telling him about how fucking weird that felt. And he said to me something to the effect of, you have to be a creep of your privilege. And that comment, even though it was at the outside of my career, I hadn't done anything yet, on an institutional level, that comment very much came to inform how I would go on to move through, or attempt to move through, institutional spaces. And so, yeah, I think I'm rambling a little bit. I haven't done something like this, but like in front of an audience. So please feel free to catch me when I lose sight of the question.
Yeah, no, I think like I'm really interested. It's good. But maybe like, so I'm thinking a little bit about what you're describing, moving through spaces. How did you continue to move through spaces? What was the work that was kind of at the core that was like moving you through those spaces?
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record on this, but my privilege was always like really at the forefront for me. And so when I got a job at a magazine where I was the first person of color on the editorial staff who wasn't an intern in its 40-year history, I fact checked that. I immediately was like, well, obviously it's my job to hold the door open for other people. And then later on, my self-appointed task was to try to make it easier for them to be there than it was for me. And I think in that sense, you know, on the one hand, it felt like I couldn't do, there's nothing else that I how do I say this? Like I needed to do this. Like I couldn't be there and not do this. But at the same time, what a massive responsibility. Like what a massive weight to carry on
A lot of pressure.
Yeah, on one set of shoulders. And what a really bad with metaphors. Like what a like high, like what a
Are?
yeah, what I'm trying to say is like what a like there's a lot of space for possible failure there. Like it's a tall order, like a lot of space for potential failure. And at the same time, I was just like, I can't be here and not do this. Like I think I would be failing my community if I don't do this.
I'm struck by how there is that responsibility that oftentimes BIPOC people who enter into institutions, art institutions, especially as the first one. So often there are programs like equity or diversity or inclusivity programs that create roles and then fill those roles. And then the responsibility of doing that work is often offloaded onto that BIPOC person in that space. And like, it's again, this weird, not like inheritance of a systemic responsibility by the individual to change the space that, I mean, arguably up until that point wasn't welcoming or didn't already facilitate or have embedded in it non-white values, beliefs, interests, investments, and so on.
Yeah, totally. I remember at the very beginning, I kind of felt like it was expressed to me in implicit and explicit ways at different times that it was almost like at the time that I was the only one there, it seemed that it was thought to be like my responsibility to like undo 40 years of exclusion, and that reflected in, you know, the kind of what I was expected to cover, and who I would what I would write about. And I took that on. Like I also was like, well, this publication has historically erased the contributions of BIPOC artists, and so of course now that I'm here, I have a responsibility to attempt to correct that in whatever way I can. I mean, the dangers of this narrative, and we can kind of circle back to this later, is just this kind of like this this narrative that comes from like a place of like self-martyrdom or something like that. Like there's still and that the discourse around the first one and the only one is pretty fucked up. So we can come back to that later, but I just wanted to like put it on as an asterisk, just to like not be like, yeah, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about like representation or tokenization, the fine line between the two, if the line exists.
So this is a tricky one, because I don't think a lot of people want to hear what I have to say about it. Because TBH, from my institutional experience, I learned that there's no correlation. There's almost zero correlation between representation and power. So at the publication that I was talking about, it was like I had like they could benefit from the optics of my work and the work of other BIPOC, but there were no optics for what it was like for us to be employees there. There were no optics for how we were treated behind closed doors, and how very little power we actually had. Not that we didn't have agency, but that we didn't have very much power. And so, yeah, I'm wary of conversations around representation, kind of just like stopping at like the demand for representation and nothing more, because it doesn't like, yeah, sure, like a gallery could be exhibiting more BIPOC, or a magazine could be publishing more BIPOC writers or whatever, but who are the people who are making the decisions, and how much regard do they have for the well-being and the safety of the BIPOC doing that labor, which is hard work. Like I found it. I always had to like explain to my white coworkers that it took a lot of emotional labor to like be working with, let's say, like emerging BIPOC writers. Like there was a lot of care and a lot of like guidance and a lot of nurturing that had to go into those relationships, or that I had to put a lot of care in my work as a journalist, as a writer, when I was working with people who, for example, had justifiable trust issues from having spoken with white journalists in the past who like misrepresented their work, or who only like showed like gave like a reductive wrote about their work in a reductive way. And so this kind of goes back to what I was trying to say about this feeling that there's this chasm between what's outward facing and what's actually happening, and between proclamation and practice. And that question around representation is one that's like, there's no way I could just like answer that in like one breath. I'm sure we'll continue to unpack it throughout, but I did want to just start out by like, poking a hole in that idea that like representation is the Messiah, because that kind of seems to be where a lot of conversations in the art world have stagnated over the past, I mean, years, but especially in the past, you know, since the movement for Black Lives in June initiated conversations in the art world around systemic racism and systemic change. It's been really frustrating for me that like people have just been like, yeah, representation will solve everything. And I'm just like, newsflash, it won't.
Can you talk about the shift for you being an institutionalized, like writing for an institution, being an institutionalized writer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I remember kind of feeling like, you know, going back to what I was saying about this feeling of responsibility, I think I got to a point where I kind of found it like a little bit like stagnating, that you know, I felt this responsibility that was both self-generated and projected, I felt, onto me, that I had to be a cheerleader. And so you know, when like I saw a show by, you know, an artist who's BIPOC that I didn't like, for example, I couldn't figure out how to deal with that. And that's actually a question that became very central to an issue that that I conceptualized and commissioned for C Magazine when I was editorial fellow there, where you know, I was trying to like explore and trying to work with writers who are exploring that question of like, you know, what it means to like what, you know, about the connection between identity and assumed expertise and advocacy, and, you know, to kind of like poke holes in that you know, this idea that like, you know, let's say only someone who's queer can write about a show by a queer artist, and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of.
Because I remember that that editorial for C Magazine. I think you quote David Garneau.
Yes.
Talk about, and something like that. And like, correct me if I'm wrong here, that his idea was that there needs to be critical discourse within either queer or a BIPOC cultural like rhetoric in order to deepen that and go beyond some sort of surface treatment that exceptionalizes the cultural production of where, you know, no one's actually engaging or moving or pushing the conversation.
Yeah, totally. I'd love if Courtney could include a link to that piece in the chat, because it's, I mean, it's.
I have it. I'll stick it in there in the break.
Cool. Yeah, it's an incredible piece, and one of my favorites I've ever commissioned. Yeah, I mean, so when I approached David's to write that piece, I think probably around this time a year ago, I wrote to him because I'd seen him give a presentation at a criticism conference in Calgary in 2017, where he talks about how settlers tend to write about Indigenous art, and how they you know, how a lot of the non-Indigenous writing about Indigenous art very much you know, is more like press releases rather than critical writing. And so when I approached him, I was like, hey, like, I've been thinking a lot about you know, what that's about, like, and this was coming off of Canada 150, when I felt like a lot of the the writing that I was seeing about Indigenous art was very much it was like, it was just so, there was just so much regurgitation, like all of it, so much of it said like almost the exact same stuff with like almost the exact same buzzwords. And it seemed that settler writers were really terrified of like looking at the work closely. And, you know, it seemed that a lot of that writing was more driven by the desire to like say the right thing, But ultimately, a lot of it kind of said nothing at all. And so I wanted to, and my understanding of it at the time, and something that I think David gets into in his piece, is that, you know, there's this like fear of like, you know, it's, yeah, there's this kind of like imperative to perform a particular like set of particular set of politics, rather than like actually engaging with something with care and with attention, and you know, with a desire to like really understand it, and to really like grapple with its nuances, and to grapple with the effect that it was having on you as a viewer. So it's almost like, you know, those pieces of writing in Canada 150 especially were more about like settler writers virtue signaling in this weird way. Yeah, I was really,
it has always struck me that like good critique is such a generous gesture, in that it's not shying away or like going for an easy. Yeah. Can you talk about what it was like to stay, and the effects of staying in an institution that had like the language of wanting you to be there as a woman of color, but hadn't actually structurally, or may not have done things to support your work daily? Like the subtext of this is asking you about failure. Like, what is the personal experience of failure?
Yeah, totally. Well, it was actually also around this time 2 years ago that I remember starting to feel, so, okay, we're in 2018, and by this point in that year, I had already taken 1 unpaid sick leave. I just got to a point where like I burnt out so hard. Like I couldn't show up for the people that, you know, I was supposed to be, or that I felt I wanted to serve in my work, and I couldn't show up for myself. And yeah, and I crashed. I like remember like feeling like I hit a brick wall, and I went on a sick leave in August of that year, and then like it wasn't even like 2 or 3 months later, I started to get a migraine that lasted 3 weeks. And lucky for me, my body collapsed one day, and I was taken to the ER, and the kind doctors there ran a bunch of tests on me. And I remember at that point I'd been trying to figure out, like, I've been prone to migraines my whole life, and I was trying to figure out what my if there were new triggers or what was going on. For that period of 3 weeks, I like couldn't open my eyes in the dark. Obviously couldn't do any work. It became clear to me from some interactions with coworkers that it was kind of like, sucks to be you, but like we have some deadlines that we have deadlines, and the show must go on. And because I continued to get worse and worse, it also became clear to me in some interactions that it was like my deterioration was a sign of like my inability to take care of myself, that I wasn't doing the right things to like get better or whatever. And so I'm so lucky that my body collapsed as a way to like just be like SOS, like this cannot go on. Like I've kind of think about it as like having been a protest, and that my body staged against me. And
Did you get a pause, like during that? What did time away, like what did that protest or what did that break yield?
Yeah, so this was, I think my body had been like trying to signal to me to get out of there for a while at that point. And I think that was kind of its like its like final cry or whatever. And I only linger on this moment so much, not, you know, not to like not to, I'm not trying to throw myself a pity party or anything like that here, but I linger on it because this was the moment when I begin to understand a lot of what we're talking about here. Because in this moment, so my body gives out. I think, you know, I'm freaking out because I think that maybe I have a brain tumor, or like, you know, I was losing my vision. And, you know, I think something is like really severely wrong with me. But when I got some tests done, it turned out that nothing was wrong with me. And as soon as I went away from work, my symptoms evaporated immediately, like almost instantly. And that in that moment, the correlation became starkly clear to me. And I think one of the worst things about that moment is that I felt really alone in it. Like I mean, I just like self-isolated in a really intense way. And for a long time I had thought about how one of the functions of institutional white supremacy is to get you to think that nobody else is going through what you're going through. And that's one of the hazards of that, like the first one or the only one, which, you know, A, is colonial as fuck, and, you know, B, kind of tells you like no one like you has survived here before, and so you won't survive either. But I've recently started to come into some research that BIPOC psychiatrists have been doing for a while about race-based trauma. And it's only like, you know, in coming across some of this research that I've begun to understand that, you know, so much of what I experience is actually like, it's boilerplate. Like it's, you know, it's like reading from a script. And it's very, I think it's very, very, very pervasive, like that BIPOC, the burnout that a lot of BIPOC feel from having to deal with institutional racism to varying degrees. Like the kind of institutional racism that I encountered is like, you know, pales in comparison to what someone who's more racialized than I am. And that's actually what's really scary about it, is that like, it's scary for me to think about, like, given all of my privilege, like how bad it was. And I'm like, fuck, like for people who aren't, how much worse is it for people who aren't as privileged as I am?
Yeah. And I'm making an assumption that it's not just events or actions that happen that are like clearly demarcated from others. Is it the pervasive sort of atmosphere? Because I think there's this assumption that it might be like micro or macro aggressions, but that it isn't actually like that the institution or the work environment may have been challenging, but it was not unique, is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, and I mean, the one of the things that I've had to recognize is that like if you're inside a structure that has its way of doing things, and then you try to change that way of doing things, of course you're going to be met with resistance. And if you're, you know, like asking questions about the way that things are done, and I mean, the art world has this just like, wow, like incredible persistence on this idea that it's like, well, this is how it's done, so this is how we're going to do it. That, you know, basically what I'm trying to say is that nobody wants to dismantle a system that benefits them. And so when you're inside a structure and you're like, we need to dismantle this, like they they don't want that. That's not what they want. And then they're like, oh shit, you're a problem. Like you're a problem, and we need to manage you as a problem. And yeah, I mean, I think that so much of what I'm talking about, like both with, you know, this instance around my illness and just in general, kind of like this broader, you know, feeling, or not feeling, but being made to feel like I was a problem. I internalized so much of that, like so hard. Like I really did feel like, man, like I'm getting this migraine that is debilitating me because I'm just really bad at managing stress, and I'm just really bad at taking care of myself, and I need to like learn some stress management techniques.
Mindfulness.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I need to be doing some yoga. Actually, no joke, like yoga kind of low key saved me. But you know, it's yeah, like I like internalized so much of that, where, you know, to the point of being like, yeah, like feeling like, yeah, it's not like I'm incompetent. I'm, you know, I'm like all of this is indicative of like shortcoming or incompetence on my part, rather than you know, there being like a much deeper systemic thing going on here, which, you know, I think is very much symptomatic of a culture that blames problems on individuals rather than on systems. Like, you know, that idea that like, I think the best example of that is like, you know, in the conversation around climate crisis, for example, you know, we're still being told that like we should recycle and we should, you know, stop eating meat or like whatever, that like our individual choices actually, you know, that the onus is on us as individuals and as consumers to fix climate crisis, when like, you know, there's very little concern for you know, how like, anyway, you see the logic here, right? That like deflects blame from broken systems and shifts it onto individuals.
Well, I'm really struck by the comparison that you draw, or bringing in climate crisis, that, you know, like the climate crisis, the Anthropocene, those are two moments when I can really like very clearly understand the moment that the fantasy of this like ahistorical capitalist realism that has like this, that has this deep history and has this forever future, that there is no moment you're in it. The idea that you can't, like, it's very hard sometimes if you're socialized in this to imagine life outside of capitalism. But and so there's like this fantasy that all there is capitalism, there is no other option. But when I think about like environmental disaster and kind of the extreme extractive, exploitative approach or attitude that is at the core of capitalism, I can really see that like capitalism cannot be forever. It is not sustainable, and it's not a lot left, which is terrifying. But it's also these moments when, beyond an extractive or exploitative treatment of the earth, the environment, land, water, as being things understood to be exploitable for like wealth accumulation, it's also an approach to people, being like treating individuals, laborers, producers in this extractive way, taking everything that can be gathered. And then like the earth is also, within capitalism, a place for disposability.
Yeah, totally. And within these institutional contexts, the moment you stop, you know, performing according to respectability politics, the moment you know, how do I say this? Like the moment you're like, the moment they have to like deal with you as a human and not just someone whose work and whose presence or, you know, so-called inclusion they can, you know, posture as something that they can benefit from. The moment the cost outweighs the benefit, I mean,
the
that's,
value.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, yeah, that's kind of why, you
And
know,
then a part of that is also this like idea that then the individual should be so grateful for the opportunity to participate, to prove themselves.
yeah, exactly. And it's like, yeah, period.
Yeah. So maybe we can shift and talk a bit about how you continue to like dig this internalized narrative out, how you decolonize that or queer that in your practice, in your writing now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm still trying to figure it out because I mean, I've had a lot of um, I've had a lot of mourning to do and had a lot of healing to do from that period of time. And I think one of the most, for me, one of the most tragic um, uh, consequences of it is how much it affected my writing. And so, like, I haven't back in August of this year, I published the piece for the first time in literally 2 years, which I think is a testament to just how much dealing with this kind of stuff like really gets to you. And so yeah, I'm in this period of kind of like trying to renegotiate what it means for me to be someone who writes in this particular moment. I think that it's a question that a lot of people around me who are artists and who are writers are asking themselves about, like what they can do in times of crisis. And I'm absolutely not interested in getting into a discussion about what art can do right now. But I was kind of like talking with myself about this like a couple of days ago, and I was just thinking about the elections and thinking about like the reality we live in, where I don't know about all of y'all, but like I'm basically just like sitting waiting for like the next tragedy to happen. And I think that's kind of like become a norm in the way that we're living our lives now. And and then I was like, well, if I write something and it like distracts people from that state for like a few seconds, then that's my role in the revolution. I mean, not my only one, but I think one of them, where it's like yeah, I mean, again, I kind of like go back to some of the earlier themes in our conversation around advocacy and like responsibility around that, and that returns to me now too.
Can I ask you, is that a form of optimism?
That's a really hard question today. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to think about why we do what we do and who it serves beyond ourselves. And I think that that's why like that conversation around like what can art do is just like so like to me, because I think it tends to be more Wow, I told myself I wouldn't go off on this tangent. I'll just say very quickly that it's a conversation that is more geared towards a concern for the economy of artistic production rather than the well-being of individuals and the welfare of individuals. Not that art can really like, I told myself I wouldn't do this. Okay, no, next question.
Okay. Yeah, let's shift then.
Yeah.
Sorry, and then I lost my question, but well, maybe we can talk a little bit about the idea and sort of like circle back to the idea of disrupting the status quo or the illusion that this is the only way. And in doing different projects and working in different ways, are there ways that we can, I mean, COVID is a real disruption in the status quo, for better, for worse, very confusing mixed bag. Seems very certain to me that there is no going back to the way that things were before. And so there is this moment of figuring out and grappling with what comes after. I mean, I don't know if we want to go down the road of like, I don't know if we want to go down a road of the analysis of how it is that now people are working, like working class are still working on front lines and are really like experiencing the most risk during the pandemic, but that a lot of other people are working from home with families, providing care, and the ways that the system is really failing individuals in supporting, and that governments and companies are just making or policies that protect the market or market interest, and then how that affects the individual.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have very much to say about this that hasn't been said plenty, but I think that for the purposes of this conversation, I will say that one of the kind of like few I'll be back in like literally 2 seconds. 1 second. Okay, I was just like trembling. It's cold in this room where I'm sitting. Anyway, one of the few sort of modes of organizing that's been giving me hope over the past couple of months is just a sense of urgency I've seen from a lot of folks, not that it's a luxury or an option really for a lot of people to, have to resort to doing things for ourselves. And I think that, mutual aid is really like the most sort of shining example of that. Like the fact that it's like, fuck what necessitates it, but that it's happening, I think is something that I find I can't think of a word that is not cheesy, like inspiring, but fuck it, it's inspiring. And for the past couple of months, I've just been thinking a lot about how a lot of us don't really have a choice but to imagine different ways of doing things, because the way of doing things for a long time has not worked for most of us. And I've been thinking a lot about the tyranny of business as usual, of like institutions pretending that like it's all normal, or that we're in crisis now, but like we're gonna go back to like our usual programming, like ASAP or whatever. And I don't know. I mean, I think my thoughts around this are still a little bit like they're not quite cohesive. But I want to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, and say that one of the most disconcerting things that I encountered in the time that I worked past tense in the art world is this like this allegiance to the institution above all else. And it's I think a lot of the time it was quite disheartening to like see how people like invested so much of themselves, and I'm speaking from like my own experience here, invested so much of themselves into institutions that like quite frankly couldn't care if we lived or died. And I think that reality is becoming clear to a lot of people in a lot of industries, like just how disposable we are and how our disposability varies depending on, our race, our gender, our class. And, I just feel like it's like time for us to like quit pouring ourselves into like institutions that have nothing for us, and to like pour our energies into our communities. Like, sure, yeah, work at an institution to like get paid, but like what do what about the work that like the community building that we need to do for ourselves and for each other, that like will be the only thing that will be there for us when inevitably, mark my words, all of these institutions will crumble.
Yeah, interesting how oftentimes individual allegiance to institutions is so tied to fantasies, especially around messages of, or like mission statements of inclusivity, and how especially, like white fragility is tied to needing that fantasy to be true, as opposed to supporting and listening to BIPOC people and their experiences and what they need.
Yeah, totally. But it's like been fascinating to watch conversations in the art world over the past couple of months, because I'm like, wow, the art world has finally caught on to what corporate sports has known for decades, being that there's a direct correlation between, so-called diversity and profit. Like, I think most galleries, most publications know by now that like if they don't have BIPOC staff, or if they don't exhibit or publish work by BIPOC, that like nobody's gonna read them, or that nobody's gonna like, set foot in their door, if that's a thing that people can still do. And so, yeah, I think it's like, I think that's why. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, I don't know what people signed up for when they came here tonight. So like, I'm just, you know, this is just how I feel about it.
I mean, I think we've opened a lot of boxes and we've touched on a lot of things. What might be good is to open things up, but perhaps we can take a 5-minute break so that people can stretch, move around, collect their reflections, and then we can come back and just have a conversation casually with people in the room and see what other folks' thoughts are. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, totally. And please, everyone, like feel free to ask questions about anything that I've talked about. If you want clarification on anything, if you want to challenge me on anything, like, please.
But also, like, sometimes there's a lot of pressure and, like, think of and perform a good question. If you just want to contribute to the conversation and say something that doesn't necessarily need a response but can open up a discussion, that's also really welcome. So it's 7:11 now. Let's come back at 7:16. During this time, if you'd like to write a question or conversation piece in the chat, we can read those out when we get back. Otherwise, there's also a hands up little icon, and you can put your hand up and then we'll start calling on people that way. So, okay, now it's 7:12. So let's come back at 7:17. See you all very, very soon.
Oh, not muted.
Okay, welcome back. We can start coming back to our screens. And so at this point, we would invite you to join us in conversation. If you'd like to raise your hand or enter a comment into the chat, we would love to talk to you. If you would like to speak and say your own thing, just stick up your little hand. You can do that at the bottom. There's a little moment, I think, where you can raise a hand. Just trying to find out where that reaction is. Or also just like turn on your camera and your mic and then we can do this. So there's a comment from Lauren in the chat. I'll read it out for us. Lauren writes, thanks for sharing, Merray. As a person who frequently gets stress migraines and has also felt very debilitated by them in the past, it's nice to know I'm not alone. I know you touched on it a little, but I'm wondering if you can manage, how you can manage your stress and how flexible people are with you when you do experience these migraines. I find the best solution sometimes is to just shut down and sleep, but that isn't always possible when you have a job and deadlines.
Yeah, that's a tough question. So yeah, there's several layers here. The thing about being prone to migraines is that it's an invisible disability, and it's one that not like, if you've never had a migraine in your life, you don't know how debilitating they are for people who get them. And so I think that in that example that I shared with you all, actually the most difficult thing to it's like I couldn't open my eyes even in the dark, and like was in pain that felt like, you know, my head was like, my brain was like getting turned through a meat grinder, or that, like, you know, poker was like poking in and out of one eye, etc. I'll spare you the rest. On top of that, but actually, like, what was more excruciating than that was me being like, oh no, like, I think my coworkers don't believe me. And so yeah, it's kind of a tough one, but I think one of the things that I've noticed in my body ever since is that, like, it kind of just gives me signals when it's stressed. Like, it kind of just, like, I can kind of feel, like, I can feel the, like, pain pathways get activated when, like, I've overexerted myself, or when, like, too much is going on and I'm not, like, managing it, and I can kind of start to feel it come on a little bit. And it's like my body's way of not just telling me, but kind of like making me slow down to take care of myself. And so it's not so much, yeah, like these days it's, or like after that migraine in that 3-week migraine in 2018, it's not so much a choice as much as it's you know, yeah, I don't have a choice. Yeah, on the question of how to deal with yeah, deadlines and this sort of thing. I mean, it's just like, I don't know. It's one of the, yeah, one of the like really disheartening and disconcerting and you know, quite frankly, like, disturbing things that I noticed in that time that I was sick is just like how much compassion and care and empathy, like, completely fly out the window in institutional structures. And it's funny because, you know, care is like, has been like such a buzzword and like such a like buzz concept in the art world for the past like 2 years or so. But it's, yeah, it's really like, it's, that's kind of all it is. It's just like yet another thing that, like, the art world proclaims but doesn't actually practice. And so, you know, sometimes you kind of just have to exit and like take care of yourself, because what do we have if we don't have our health? Like, what do we have if we don't have, you know, yeah, what do we have if we don't have our health? Like, in that, I remember, like, in that time when I was sick, I was just like, I'm never going to, like, allow myself to believe that my health is not, like, my first and foremost priority, like, ever again. And so I think, yeah, that's something to keep in mind, and like, it'll kind of guide how you the decisions that you make and what you do.
Well, so what I said was, thank you. So perhaps while people are typing questions into the chat field, maybe I can ask you a little bit about what you just said. And you said earlier that like being engaged in the art world, and then you said in past tense. I wonder how you know, like in promising yourself that you're going to listen to your body and that you're not going to be in that kind of a situation again, how you're constructing or envisioning your practice, your professional practice, your writing practice.
Yeah, I haven't quite figured it out, because I mean, the sort of like one thing that's kind of like made me a little bit of an outlier, in the art world, is that not a lot of people who write about art have backgrounds in journalism. And so, you know, I kind of like, since I was in school, like I remember like kind of having one foot at NASCAD and like one foot at King's, and like having finished like all of my courses at, you know, at NASCAD, but like starting to do this minor in journalism at King's, and sort of feeling like I was, you know, I didn't quite fit either here or there. And I what I'm trying to say basically is that like I have the luxury of like not needing to like practice as a writer within the confines of the art world. Like I can be a journalist, I can be a critic, and I don't need, you know, to be an art worker to be able to do that work. And that's like a massive luxury. But at the same time, it's not like, you know, the media / journalism industry is like remotely any less fucked than the art world. But you know, it's at least like not, I think there's not like I think that not having not having like an allegiance to like to this like very limited ecosystem is something that allows me the luxury of like deciding. It's not a luxury really, it's a necessity for me to be able to decide like why I'm writing what I'm writing and who I'm writing it for, and you know what I can do with that work to leverage and like to leverage things that I causes that I care about.
Thanks, Merray. There's 2 questions in the chat. Julie, do you want me to read out your question, or would you like to read out your own question in the mic? Just type that in the chat field or unmute yourself. Okay, so Julie writes, hey Merray, everything you've been saying is so validating. You touched a little bit on how working in institutions correlates with security at times and money. For someone who has a master's in the art field, I often feel pressured to have a job in the art field, and it can feel like a failure not to. I interned within publications, wrote articles, and have been rejected from gallery positions the past year after graduating, and was making salads in the local grocery store the entire time. I feel like it's something that isn't talked about a lot. What are your thoughts about how art workers make money while staying connected to the art world, for BIPOC especially?
Yeah, thank you for your question. To be completely honest, it's a tough one for me to answer, given how privileged I've been. Like I got my first institutional job like a year and a half out of school, and you know, while that was fortunate, it was also like in you know, mid 2016 was like this kind of this time in the art world where you know, people are talking about like representation and inclusion, in a really big way for the first time in my generation. And I kind of encountered this like really insidious thing where like basically in interactions, both professional and like extra institutional interactions, especially with white people, there seemed to be this kind of like implication that, I'm just so lucky I happen to be in the right place at the right time. Let me spell that out for you. It's like, you're lucky you're a woman of color who happened to be working in this time. And so there's this kind of like implication that like, I was really only there because of who I was and not what I was able to do. And I really internalized that. Like, I really felt like, oh yeah, I'm so lucky that I'm here. And like, the imposters, the like racialized imposter syndrome from that was like quite like pretty bad. But it, at the times when it was like, when doing that work was like, truly, like, I'm not exaggerating when I said that, like, when I say that, like, it like felt like it was killing me. I was just like, I'm making $35,000 a year. So it's not like, so it's kind of funny how like working in the art world is kind of like seen as this like major privilege, but it's like, you're barely making a living wage. And at the same time, you're like, like you're stretched too thin. You're like to the point of like not being able to do anything for your community or for yourself. And it's like, what's the point? Like just so I can have the like, just so I can like look good for, doing the right thing and like working in the art world or whatever. And so anyway, what I'm trying to say to you is that like those people who like glamorize working in the art world and make you feel like it's a failure not to, are probably trust fund kids whose parents, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't any space for narratives of it not working, or of the way that it's hard. Thank you so much, Julie, for your question. Thank you, Merray, for your thoughtful response. There's another question in the chat from Blaze. Blaze says, Blaze, jump on the mic if you want to say your own question. Otherwise, I'm very happy to read that out. Okay. I will read it out. So they write, hey Merray, earlier you talked about feeling alone in dealing with institutionalized racism. How and where did you find access support during that time? What exactly was that support, and what support did you wish that you had access to?
Ooh, this is a question that makes me really sad, because I did not have any support at that time, except that I was really lucky that my boss advocated for me, and encouraged me to prioritize my well-being, but otherwise, one of the things that kind of came about in those years is that like I was just stretched so thin, and like also like always so paranoid, as someone, as like a very, as someone who had the like very uncommon privilege of like being a young person who had a position of institutional power. There's no like nice way to say this, but basically I was and rightfully like extremely paranoid that like, people just like wanted to be my friends because I was in a position to be able to like do something for them. And that was proven to be the case in many scenarios. And so I kind of like, I think especially in the time when I was just like well, it's like my fault, or like, well, it's like my failure that I'm going through this. I really self-isolated. And wow, that really takes on a different meaning now. But yeah, I like hid myself away because I was ashamed of what I was going through, and I was ashamed of what I was feeling. And it's only like, it's only like in June when like this flood of BIPOC, thanks in no small part to the movement for Black Lives emboldening, one of its many consequences being to embolden people to speak their truth, and how that had ripple effects for art workers of color in the art world. It was only like in seeing so many testimonials from people where, it's again, like as I was saying, it was like, it's the same script. It's like the same story over and over and over again. And it was only like in that moment that I was like, holy shit, like I didn't have to be alone in that time. And, it was only, it was only in that moment that I like began to really understand one of the many ways that like institutional white supremacy, as I was saying earlier, like really, really isolates you from community, and like turns BIPOC against each other, which is something that I experienced in the workplace, I experienced in my community. And it's like, hey y'all, like we're fighting the wrong fight here. Like we're supposed to be, anyway. Yeah. And so now I think this is why I feel like it's really important for us to like turn as much of our energy and as much of our effort as possible into nurturing our communities and doing whatever we can to support each other with the power, with the capital, with the privilege that we have access to. And like that there are people, I hope that like people who work in institutions take that responsibility seriously. Yeah.
Thanks, Merray. Okay, well, if you have a burning thought, a burning question, something you'd like to share, please slide it into the chat. Or
I do. Oh, sorry. We'll let Sadie go first. But I have a question too, if nobody else does afterwards. Sadie, do you want me to? I'm going to start reading unless you start shortly. Okay, I'm going to read. Merray, thanks so much for doing this. Following on to the question about care, your recognition that many people volunteer, an allegiance to institutions that couldn't care whether they live or die rings very true to me. I think many people who have the privilege of working in unionized workplaces try to enshrine the basics of an expectation of care from their employer into collective agreements. I would be super interested in what you have to say about this route, as it shows these relations that should be outside the money system into a ritual of collective bargaining along with monetary compensation.
Thank you for your question, Sadie. I'm not qualified to answer it because I've never worked. Yeah, I've never been employed at a place with a union. So if there's somebody, yeah, I know. So if there's somebody else in the audience who could speak to this and feels comfortable doing so, I invite them to.
Or Sadie, if you want to. Or Eleanor King writes in the chat, I have. Eleanor, do you want to hop on your mic or into the chat?
I just really actually wanted to say hi to Merray.
Hi.
But thank you to Julie and the Center for Art Tapes for presenting this excellent talk. I'm sorry I came late because I was literally saw your thing on or on Instagram and then like logged in immediately. So just thank you for all your thoughts and the things that you've said, Merray. Really, really appreciate it. I was struck thinking about my own position in an institution. I work at Purchase College, and right now I supervise like a whole bunch of people, and working in a unionized workplace actually is really important in the sense that I can actually give my employees like a day off today, when, especially my employees of color who are like, I'm fucking traumatized right now. I can't show up for work. I have the privilege and ability to say, that's fine, and embed that care into our workplace. And so I don't know how we get back to unions, and they certainly have their flaws in lots of ways, but it saddens me to think that there's so many people like yourself and our generation is not that far apart from one another, but like the expectation that you would ever be in a union to you, 10 years below me, it doesn't make any sense. Do you know what I mean? It's like our entire workforce has just like slid into precarity in a matter of less than a generation, like a decade, through, probably the rise of the internet. So anyway, we could talk about that for a really, really long time, but I definitely hope that young folks will try to figure out how to unionize themselves. And like you said, we have to be building the institutions that we want to see in the world, I guess, and using our privilege in whatever way we can. So thank you for saying that all the time. And I know that you don't feel like art matters. We've had this conversation many times, but like, I realized the other day that I was like watching some freaks like make a crazy video, and I was like, damn, that's inspiring. And that helps me see like difference in the world and see, and living in New York, it's like the thing that makes me excited and about being alive is seeing how people are able to express themselves absolutely the way that they want to be in terms of their gender expression, and they're not to feel, anyway, I don't know how to say this, but I just like what you do is important because you show other people a path forward. And I hope that everyone just continues to make their work in whatever way that they can and participate in their community in whatever way that they can.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate you saying this, because it helps me like refine a little bit what I was trying to say, in the sense that it's important for us to think about how our work as artists and as writers could exist outside of the political economy of the art world, and how we can reimagine who it ought to serve, beyond just like, who's showing where and who's showing what or whatever, which is something that I know actually comes from conversations that you and I have had over the years. It's like, I feel like you also get me to think about this question of like, I remember like in 2016 when I first started working in magazines professionally, the like thing that was said at the time was to like, give voice to the voiceless, or like whatever, like, and to like hand the mic over and just like all of these like, metaphors around that. And I came to say like, well, like if you're still the one who's holding the mic, then you can pull it away whenever the fuck you want. Right. And so I think it's important for those of us who have power and who have privilege to like really think about how to redistribute it and how to seed it. And I think that's a really uncomfortable question. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people, myself included.
Well, because we live in a competitive capitalist society, we automatically assume that like us giving it up to someone else means that it creates a lack in us, instead of imagining that it creates wealth for all of us.
Yeah, scarcity mentality is really like the elephant in the room right now.
Anyway, thank you. And
thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. I also like that Eleanor brought up the point of like, if you see a lack or a vacancy in the world, create the thing, like the way that you created an art publication, Crit. Courtney, you had a thought, a question?
Yeah, I've had so many thoughts and Really, yeah, I'm really excited by everything that's being said tonight. So thanks so much. I think like the scarcity mode that you're talking about, I'll get back to what I was going to ask you, but the scarcity mode point, like, I feel like there's two sides to it. It's like the thing of like the scarcity and the like wanting to protect opportunities and keep them to ourselves. And then also you talked about it a little bit in a different context, but the idea of like martyrdom in the arts and being an interim ED during a pandemic, like, oh my goodness, so much of that is happening right now. And I've caught myself in it too, of like, if I don't do this, who will? And I'm going to save the art world, like just like really absurd things. So anyways, that's more of a thought, but I appreciate that point. And then the question I wanted to ask, and please feel free to reject this and say no if you don't want to talk about it, because you already said you didn't want to talk about it a bit, but the thing around like giant eye roll around like, you know, what can art do? I feel that too, and I don't want you to answer that question. I'm curious to know though, like where that sort of eye roll reaction or the like just total disinterest in answering that question, if that's been a thing in you for a while. Did that kind of get kickstarted with the pandemic? I know that for me, like being in my job, I thought I would spend the year in my position feeling like I had to defend that art matters, and I actually feel very differently, and I'm like, fuck this, I'm not interested in talking in this way about art. So I'm curious to know, like, when that started for you. Has it kind of developed and changed over time?
It's that's a really great question. I appreciate you asking me to like refine that position a little bit more, because it is worth saying that eye roll comes from having been witness to that conversation. You know, that question being asked by the art world. We don't have enough time for me to like get into like the loadedness of that term, but I'll just say for now really quickly that it's a self-serving question that I've seen the art world establishment ask itself over and over again, and it's really a question that I've come to understand as being one that has the ulterior motive of actually trying to figure out how to co-opt the political language of you know, let's say movement building, or the political language used by BIPOC, the political language essentially used by those who are in the immediate face of the crisis, whatever crisis is / crises are at hand. So it's really like that question for me. I've come to understand it as a reflection of like, what can the art world do to like monetize this? Like, what can the art world do to like, you know, respond to this and like turn it into like, you know, curatorial thematics, and turn it into like, you know, publication thematics, and so on and so forth. And, you know, I think that like working, like this moment of like working at a publication at a time when it was producing an issue about care and wellness, while like, you know, witnessing and experiencing very viscerally firsthand that it could not care it could not care less about care and wellness, like was this moment for me where I was just kind of like, oh, it's just about like this question of like, what can art do is really more like a question of like, what can we do to capitalize on, you know, like you know, a cause du jour or whatever. I don't know if that was terrible. This is actually the first time that I've spelled it out. Does that help? Does it make sense?
I think it does. Yeah, definitely. And I think like when framing it, like when actually kind of unpacking capitalism is being like the catalyst for that question, or being the reason why that question even has to exist in that type of framework, like I think it answers the question without directly answering the question too, which I appreciate.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think it's just like, it's probably a perspective that comes very specifically from like having worked in publications and, you know, kind of seeing the way that like, yeah, there's this funny way where you like you really get like a firsthand taste of like how the art world works when you work for a magazine. And it's like so nasty to watch how like really, really urgent and like really real crises really just become moments, like opportunities for the art world to like draw from. And we've seen that with COVID, right? Like we've seen that with you know, the art world being like, you know, trying to, anyway, I mean, you see what I'm saying, right? So yeah, it's just exhausting. And then it just becomes about like the next trend and the next, like the next thing. And there's no regard for like the people, the communities who are affected. There's no regard for, you know, yeah. Oh, hi, Anne. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you challenging me on that. So like if anybody else has, you know, if there are similar kind of like other ideas that I mentioned here and there that anybody wants to get me to like expand a little bit more, I'm very happy to.
There's something that that with the last answer that occurred to me, and thank you for answering, because I had thought that maybe that question about what can art do might come from a suspicion that that people in the art world or artists could not do anything, and I think, okay, that's related also to the kind of the way capitalism kind of works, in terms of, you know, you're maybe attached to the institution because you think it's the only thing that's going to protect you, and then you realize that it's not going to protect you, or something, or you think that maybe you're gonna, like, you have to capitalize on an idea of like what can art do, meaning that, you know, like maybe from an imposter syndrome that I really can't do anything, and then you have to kind of get the, you know, kind of seize the opportunity before you're you know, kind of thrown to the wolves, you know. But I don't know. I thought that. Thank you for answering.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So I just also want to read out the comment that was in the chat for folks. So Anne had said, "Thank you so much for sharing yourself in this conversation, Merray. Always great to hear your thoughts and voice so many shared feelings."
Anne was one of the people who co-founded Create with me.
It's amazing the kinds of things that come out of collective, like
Frustration.
Commiseration. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I invite, if anyone has a last thought, closing comment, please slide into the chat or onto the mic. But for now, maybe I'll take this opportunity to extend to you, Merray, my deep, deep, deep heartfelt gratitude for coming and being so vulnerable and so open in this conversation and sharing so much of your brilliant analysis and also your just heartfelt embodied experience, which is a really profound gift.
Thank you for making it safe for me to do so.
Really glad to be in conversation with you this evening.
Me too.
Thank you to everyone who has come and joined into this conversation and been here. It has been a pleasure for me and for you, Merray.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to make assumptions.
No, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely been a pleasure for me, and also like really, you know, it's special to it feels precious for me to have space to articulate these questions, these concerns, because I felt for the past little while that it's yeah, I think that when you work in a realm that is like fragile, that is run by, you know, scarcity mentality, there's this kind of like hush hush, like we can't criticize it, because if we criticize it, it's going to fall apart. But like, fucking let it fall apart, you know, and like, let's actually like build something that like that is by us and for us, and that cares about us, you know. Like I don't, yeah,
Don't have allegiance to this art world or this cultural system.
Yeah, because it doesn't give a fuck about me, as it is like evidently demonstrated. So I mean, it's given me like ample evidence that it does not. And so I feel like it's just like important for me to think about how to do my work in a way that like doesn't serve an institution, and that like serves people. And I think that's going to, I'll say really quickly that I've completely, Eleanor, if you're still here, my heart goes out to you. Eleanor's in the States right now. I was telling Julie earlier today when we were talking about this conversation that I've kind of tuned out a lot of what's going on, just because it feels like until things are more certain, we're really prone to like our nervous systems just like really spiking and crashing. And I think it's important for us to like do all that we can to like reserve what little energy many of us have left to like really try to figure out how we're going to have to mobilize in the coming while, regardless of who wins, you know. And I think that it's really a time for people who are artists, people who are writers, who are curators, who are, you know, like, we're really scrappy people who like know how to work with very little. I think it's time for us to like there are a lot of skills actually that we've been forced to develop in our practices over the years that we've, you know, that we've been nurturing them, that I think will really serve us in this time, no matter what happens.
That's a beautiful last word.
Well, let's see how we feel tomorrow morning.
Well, regardless, we'll have work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make sure that like folks feel, I mean, Julie's done plenty of that, but I just want to like take one more moment to make sure that anyone who has anything to say feels that there's space to say it. My mom's checking up on me.
Say hi to your mom.
She's just gone now. Oh, right. I love you, Nadia.
Be sure to read the really wonderful messages in the chat, all thanking you.
Oh, this is so affirming. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for making it really, I mean, feel so safe to share what I've shared. There's this funny way in which doing things via screen can feel like really disconnecting and really alienating, but sometimes there's like a really palpable energy in a Zoom room that like makes you feel like you can actually like share with the people who hold that space for you. And so I really appreciate all of you who've made it feel safe and comfortable to get really vulnerable and to talk about things that I think are really unsavory and that are, I think, inconvenient for a lot of people. And so, yeah, and thank you for people who've asked questions and who've contributed by listening and being present. I really appreciate it. Shall we say goodbye?
Courtney, any last words?
Yeah, I just want to say, we're saying it so much, but thank you so much, Merray. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to Ioka and Amanda, our ASL interpreters tonight, and to Kimberly, who's been providing closed captioning services tonight. And thanks for everyone for coming. I'll just put in a plug for our final event of this series, which is Wednesday, November 25th at 6 p.m. Atlantic time. We'll be joined by Julie again, who will be facilitating, with Charvel Rapos, Kashif Ghani, and Tara Taylor. It'll be a panel discussion, all past participants of CFAT's Media Arts Scholarship Program. So hope to see you there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Good night. Take care of yourselves.
Hi.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.